Here we go. All right, today we are going to be talking about user input and how we can actually interact with the user in our program. So before we talk about user input, let's first discuss who is the user. The user is the person who is interacting with your code while it's running. So we, in this class, are going to be filling the role of both the programmer and the user. We're often going to be doing both of these jobs. However, it is possible that someone who is not us will be the person clicking that run code button. Often I will be running your code. I will be the user for the code that you were the programmer for. So in that scenario, you want to make sure that your program is accessible and easy to use by this end user. Make sure that your code can run and makes sense to run for the person who is interacting with it. So let's talk about interactivity. Thus far, our programs have only been interacting with the user in one direction. We have had our programs sending information to the user. There's information only going out of our program. Today, we're going to learn how to add the other direction of interactivity. We're going to let the user enter information into our programs. So we should all recognize this skeleton. This is the code that we start off with in our Java programs. And we're going to add 2 lines. Boom, 2 lines. So we're going to add 1 line up at the very top above that public class my program. So this is going to be the first thing in our code. And we're going to add another line inside of our main. So I'm going to break down what those 2 lines are, what they mean. So here's our first line. It says import java.util.scanner. So what we're doing here, the import keyword lets us add code to our program that isn't baked into our default Java. And it's not baked into our default Java just so that our code doesn't take up more space than it needs to. So what we're including here, what we're importing, is this scanner class, which is what we're going to use to actually perform user input. Java.util is what's known as a package. Packages are used to group code into essentially a folder for easy access and grouping of similar chunks of code. And then scanner is a class within that java.util package. And scanner is going to contain code that is designed to allow us to perform user input. So it's going to let us interface with the user and accept what they type on the keyboard. The second line we add says scanner input equals new scanner system.in and then semicolon. So on this line of code, I am declaring and initializing a variable of the scanner type. So just like in any other declaration, I need to tell my variable what the type of the data will be. And the type of data we're creating is scanner. Just like int or string, this is a data type. We're using this import statement to add this data type to our program. And now we are creating a variable with the scanner data type. And then the other part of our declaration is the variable's name. Input is not a special word. This is just the name of this variable. I'm naming it input because this is the variable I will be using to perform my user input, but you could name this variable anything you want. It just like any other variable, you can name it whatever you like. but it makes sense to name it relative to what it's supposed to be doing. And this variable will be helping us do user input. So I've named it input. On the right side, we have the value that we are assigning to that variable called input. New scanner is what we use to initialize a variable of the scanner type. And I'll explain why we're doing this and why we need a new word, why we have the same name as the type. I'll talk about that next unit. We're going to get more in depth on what all of that means. And then we have our system.in. This is the value in Java that is going to typically correspond to the actual keyboard on our computer. And it lets us get keyboard data into our program. We're using the same system as when we did system.out, which is what we used when we were printing, when we were sending information out of our program. So we're going to use that same system in our interface for getting information both in and out of our programs. Lights. Those two lines of code make sense what they are and why we need them. Okay, extended silence as a sure. All right. So now that we know the setup for performing user input, let's talk about how to actually do it. There are two necessary elements for getting user input. Number one, we need a method to retrieve that user input. And two, we need somewhere to actually save it. We've already learned how to do number two. We can use variables to store the information. So now we're going to talk about how to actually retrieve that data. In Java, there are three different functions for collecting user input. Once I have created my scanner typed variable, my input variable, I can use input.nextLine, .nextInt, or .nextDouble, and those will retrieve the next line, which will give me a string value, the next integer, give me an integer value, or the next double, give me a double value, as you can probably guess. So we have three different functions to collect three different types of information from the user. Does how I access those functions make sense? Does that track? And I'll go into some examples and what this looks like in just a minute. All right. So as you can see, I've created my variable input. All three of these are referencing that input variable. If I remove that input, I'm going to get an error saying, hey, you may have forgotten to declare that next line, or it's out of scope, which means I can't just say, get the next line. Next line has to come from inside that variable that I declared of the scanner type. It needs to come from there. All right, so what if I instead try to get a nextInt and save it into a string? What do we think will happen in this scenario?
Type
That's
error.
yes. Say again?
Type error.
You'll get an error, correct. You'll get that incompatible types, int cannot be converted to string error, because we're trying to save an integer into a string variable. And as we've discussed before, that's not allowed. So unlike in other languages, these three input functions cannot include a prompt. So if we want to prompt the user for information, we want to tell the user what we expect them to type in, we need to use a system.out.print on the previous line of our code to actually tell the user, hey, I want you to type this information in. So, for example, this is a program that will accept the user's input as, or their name as input, and then say, it's so nice to meet you. So we have our input variable being declared and initialized, a system.out.print, enter your name. I'm declaring my variable name as a string, and it equals input.nextLine. So whatever the user types in, it's going to be saved into that name, that variable name. And then I'm going to print, it's so nice to meet you, print their name, and then print line and exclamation point. When I run this next line or either of the other two functions, the program is going to stop until the user presses the enter key on their keyboard. Until they have finished typing and press enter, I'm going to not do anything. I'm going to just hold off. Does this process make sense? That I need a prompt, then I can do my input. Yeah? Okay. All right, so there is a slight problem with using next line after nextInt. And that's because of the way that Java handles input when using the nextInt and a nextDouble functions. So those two functions will only read the numerical part of our input. And then when the user types in enter, it's going to leave that enter keystroke in the queue of things that are to be input. I'll show you what this looks like. So I have my system.print, enter your age, boom, enter your age. Age equals nextInt. So the user types in 50, presses enter. That's going to say, I'm done with my input. NextInt is going to read that 50. Then I say, enter your name, and nextLine is going to see that enter statement. It's going to see that new line, and it's going to say, oh, there's an enter. I'm going to grab that and save that into this variable, because it's essentially in the queue of things going into through our input feed. So when I print hello and name stores nothing. It stores an empty string because our next line is going to read everything up until the new line and just get rid of the new line character. So our string is just going to be empty. Does the reason this problem exists make sense? Yeah? Please feel free to ask me to repeat. This is a weird thing. So the way that we can fix this is we need to add a buffer next line that's going to it's going to just consume that extra new line and actually let the user type something in the next time we use a next line. So when I ask for their age and do a nextInt, right after that, I'm just going to put an input.nextLine. Now, I don't need to save this into a variable because it's just going to be a blank string. All I need is to actually perform this next line so that the blank space from this nextInt goes away. It gets removed from my input queue. And now I can say, enter your name and do an input.nextLine. And this will actually wait for the user to type something in and then press enter. Does this solution to that problem make sense? How we can fix that issue? All right. Any questions at all about the getting user input in Java? All right. Then I will stop share. I will